how, of course, the printing press changed everything and comics became a big thing. And I like that some of the two first comics were called A Harlot's Progress and A Rake's Progress. I was like, hell yeah, we know where our bread's buttered even back then.
You know what? Smut has always been a thing, man.
And also, tell me about the quote-unquote worst people. Tell me about...
That's where all the good stories are, man.
Exactly, yeah. Like, you're not going to read, like, the rich diplomat who sat in his tea room all day. Like, that is a boring-ass story. I have no interest in it. Hello, and welcome to Comic Dissection, the podcast where we examine comic books through a intersectional leftist lens. I am your host, the cyborg, Reno Tino Valentino. And with me, as always, is Cecilia Rose.
Yep.
And today, it's class time, folks. Welcome to Understanding Comics 101. This is worth exactly 0 college credits. But by God...
On the other hand, it would be the most fun college course you could probably take.
It really would, and the cheapest.
Well, also that.
If we're...
We can give you very specific courses on things like...
Very specific things.
Very specific comics. This is what we're doing here.
The Holocaust viewed by mice. Understanding comics. How cool Catwoman is. Important stuff.
Yes.
But today... Understanding Comics, The Invisible Art by Scott McCloud. Now, this was published in 1993, and after looking at that date again, my brain kind of melted because, man...
I was 3 years old.
I was considerably older. We don't have to talk about how old, just know I was older. And I guess I'm impressed by how fucking pertinent this still is.
Yeah.
Like, it's still very amazing. And all these people, like Neil Gaiman, you must read this book, says Neil Gaiman. Will Eisner, bravo. Understanding Comics is a landmark dissection and intellectual consideration of comics and as a valid medium. Anyone interested in literary form must read it. Alan Moore. Understanding Comics is quite simply the best analysis of the medium that we have ever encountered. Everybody... Oh, and here's one you might recognize. Art Spiegelman.
We're bringing it all around.
The guy that did Mouse. Cleverly disguised as an easy-to-read comic book. And Spiegelman would know about cleverly disguising stuff as a comic book.
He really would.
Scott McCloud's simple-looking tome deconstructs the secret language of comics while casually revealing secrets of time, space, art, and the cosmos. The most intelligent comic I've seen in a long time. Bravo. So, anyone in the comic world agrees that if you want to learn about the art of comicking and why comics are considered a valid art, because in 1993, that was a battle that was still being fought. As in 2023, it is a battle still being fought.
30 years have passed, and nothing has changed. It's amazing
It's
amazing how often that's the case, isn't it? Just to be really depressing, because that's going to be the through line for the next, I guess.
Well, let me tell you about how I used to have to make phone calls in 1992, and we'll talk about how
dial-up
things have changed.
Service.
Yes. The internet came by mail, and it was called the Yellow Pages, and that's how we looked up things.
You couldn't log on to the computer if someone was also talking on the phone.
No, it made this horrible sound.
Horror stories.
This is another nightmares from the past. You think racism was a big deal? Imagine not being able to be on the internet and making a phone call at the same time. Dun, dun, dun.
You had to wait for your memes to load.
It was true. It was a nightmare, I'm telling you. But yes, so a lot of Understanding Comics is about defending comics as a fair and just medium. And like we said, it's 2023. Comics are a little more respected now. Like, they are our forms of entertainment. Most of the last big movies have been...
The MCU exists.
Yes.
And, I feel like that is...
Yeah, Sandman is on Netflix. Like, shit be happening. But it's still rare to get it in an art gallery. It's still rare for... With the exception of, Action Comics number 14.
That, I don't know that I understand... And maybe this is because I'm a plebeian, but I don't know if I understand why people think art galleries are important.
Clout is determined by rich people, and they've decided that museums are where you get clout.
I guess.
If your art makes it to a museum, it's clouty, and if it doesn't, it's not. Is that fair? No, I don't think it is.
I've never really, I don't understand why people want to be high art, I guess is maybe the better way to put it. Yeah. But maybe that's just, again, I'm a plebeian, and I don't run in art circles, so maybe I just don't have the right kind of friends who know why this is important.
That's fair. But I think it's more about getting more people into the conversation. A lot of people need to believe that it's okay to read comics. Like, you still run into adults that are just, very dismissive of comics. Like, oh yeah, I read them when I was a kid. And
the cartoons, too. But I do think, I was actually going to mention this later, because he talks about... He talks about something at some point, but since we're skipping.
Yeah.
I do think that he would honestly be really proud of millennials, because I think millennials and the generations after us are some of the first generations who are like, no, I'm still going to watch my cartoons, and I'm still going to enjoy the things that make me happy, because the world sucks, and I'll take my serotonin wherever the fuck I can get my serotonin.
We have loved and embraced comics as no generation before.
Well, and we just never stopped. I still watch Sailor Moon. I'm 32 years old. And I still watch Sailor Moon.
It sounds like, hi, Cecilia. We're all in a circle.
This is the intervention.
Yeah, we're actually going to debunk Scott McCloud and tell you're wasting your life. Just kidding. No. We love this shit. So I'm going to quickly read his introduction, which the whole thing... Because we are a comic podcast, the whole thing is done in a comic format.
Yes. It's
a comic about comics. This is very meta in that respect.
It's actually really interesting. I really appreciate the comic about comic aspect of it.
It was a great delivery system.
It is.
If you're trying to convince people of the value of your form, use your form.
If you want, we can do this as a back and forth, and I'll be Matt.
Okay, yeah, sure. So in the first page, he's talking to his friend, Matt, about his next project, which is this book we're holding in our hands.
So, Scott, what's your next project going to be now that you've finished Zot?
Well, it's a bit hard to describe, Matt. It's sort of a comic book about comics.
You mean like a history?
Not exactly, no. Although there is some history in it. It's more an examination of the art form of comics. What it's capable of, how it works. How do we define comics? What are the basic elements of comics? How does the mind process the language of comics? That sort of thing. I have a chapter on closure, all about what happens between the panels. There's one on how time flows through comics, another on the interaction of words and pictures and storytelling. I even put together a new comprehensive theory on the creative process and its implications for comics and for art in general.
Oh. Are you kind of young to be doing that sort of thing?
And the last panel is him just holding the phone in silence.
I really hate the notion that age makes you smarter. Just as a general concept, I really wish we could just destroy that.
Yeah. Well, but Scott, he soldiers on despite that lack of support there at the beginning. And my first note is on page 4. He's talking about the world of comics and how huge and varied it is and how it has to encompass so many different things. Mm-hmm. And there's this beautiful globe. I fucking love it. He's standing at the base of this, ridiculously large globe, and it's just got everyone from Astro Boy to Spider-Man to Sailor Moon, and it was a runner-up for favorite panel. The way he uses the comics and just visual pictures to talk about what he's trying to do, man, And
I also really appreciate how he talks about the possibilities in the comic, like in the art form of comics.
Yeah.
This book was really, like, optimistic.
It really was. And I like at first he's trying to explain the difference between the medium and the thing presented, and how you cannot like one and still like the other one. And he's trying to describe what comics are. And he's doing it in a stand-up. Like, he's on stage and people are just yelling out things trying to help him define what comics are. And at one point someone says, "What about Batman? Shouldn't it have Batman in it?" And I'm like, yeah, if you were trying to define comics, yeah, you're gonna need Batman. Because
I really like on page 5
where
he says, to define comics, we must first do a little aesthetic surgery, and he's got an axe. Yeah. And it was just a real aesthetic surgery with an axe is something I really appreciate the notion of.
Yes.
But this is actually something that I wanted to talk about real quick. Please. Is that this is one of my most favorite things that exist, is when you take things apart. Like, because he goes through this whole big set of just defining how a comic exists.
Yeah.
And like
what are the defining features it must have?
Yes. But I just like the notion of just breaking stuff down into all their little tiny parts and examining all the little pieces.
Yeah.
And like, this was fun for me.
Oh,
these two, and he does it later too with other
Anytime
parts.
you're doing stuff with language like this, like things that seem deceptively simple, like, hey, define a comic. And who was it? Will Eisner, the famous comic artist, defined it as sequential art. Mm-hmm. And he's like, well, that's the definition we'll use most of the time. Yeah. But technically, and then he goes into the spiel about all the things that could be considered art. And it's...
I do think, I was reading this, and as I did write down, sometimes I feel like trying to nail down a definitive idea of anything is just a nightmare. Like, this is just an exercise in futility.
Yes.
Like...
Well, and I think that's why he did it in that stand-up form where he's taking comments from the audience.
Yeah.
Like, oh, we're just trying to find a definition of comics that makes everyone happy. And it's like, yeah, good fucking luck.
Right? Why aren't the superheroes in this? It's not a real definition if you don't have Batman in it. But he does eventually come to a definition that is plural in form, used with a singular verb, juxtaposed pictorial and other images in deliberate sequence, intended to convey information and or produce an aesthetic response in the viewer. And then in the second, there's a number 2 that just has superheroes, bright colorful costumes.
Yeah. Yeah, you know,
comics.
The stuff I bring, the stuff Reno brings to the podcast.
Not the stuff Cecilia brings.
No. So then he goes into the history of comics, and the extremely obvious but thing that I never really thought of is that we don't actually know where the first comics came from, because, you know, if you go back far enough, they get really hard to define. He talks about stuff from the Aztecs. He talks about Japanese silk script, which are the long scrolls that they used to write sequential art stories on. He talks about hieroglyphs. He talks about like fucking druids. Like, he's like, yeah, we're not sure, but all this stuff. And he also, interestingly enough, talks about the difference between like a comic story and like hieroglyphics, for example, where the symbol represents a sound and you put sounds together to make words. Like, it's the difference between hiragana and katakana in Japanese and kanji. Kanji is where a symbol represents an entire word, whereas hiragana and katakana are just like our alphabet. Like, they represent sounds. You put them together and make words. And even then, the kanji is still just a symbol. Like, it's not a story until it's pictures in sequential order telling a story.
But the hieroglyphs are like, some of the hieroglyphs are also that. On page 14, he talks about how there is a story to like this 3-panel part.
Yeah, he was just reading it the wrong way. Yeah, or the people who
took the sections out took out parts without completing the story.
Yeah.
So it is kind of a comic. Hieroglyphs and Aztec inscriptures are actual comics. They are pictures in an order that tell a story.
Yeah.
Which is, it wasn't a thing I'd ever considered, but it is a beautiful fucking notion, isn't it?
Yeah, as would be done 2,700 years later in Mexico, the Egyptians read their comic zigzag. And this created all sorts of problems for people trying to understand the story they were trying to tell. Because, again, you were looking to it through a European lens. Like,
yeah, I do. That was actually my biggest problem, as I told you before. My biggest problem with this whole book, my only complaint is the focus on Western ideas.
Yeah.
Because, and it was the same thing as, like, with when he's talking about, like, reading it in certain orders. As someone who reads more manga than American comics,
yeah,
I don't always assume that things go from left to right.
Yeah.
You know?
I remember my first manga. Nowadays, 90% of manga, when you buy it in the store, if you open it at the front, it's like, hey, there's a page. It's like, hey, you're doing this wrong.
Turn it around, dumbass.
Yeah. And the first mangas I got did not have that. And so I was, like, confused. And then you would occasionally get ones that had been transcribed opposite for American audiences. So you would often get a manga back in ye old days of like 1994 where you didn't know which way to read it. You were like, did they Americanize this or not? And sometimes they would Americanize the panels but not the page numbers. And it was a nightmare. It was a fucking... Because these were small publishing houses, because manga had no or little audience.
Comics weren't respected. Japanese comics,
Jesus,
especially not respected. But it is. I actually kind of prefer it now, where they leave it alone, and you have to change what you do to read that.
Oh, agree. Yeah, agree. As one of those snooty kids who doesn't like dubbing and only watches subtitles, like, give it to me as close to the original as my stupid non-speaking their language mind can get.
Yes.
Like, get me as close as we can get. Then he talks about how, of course, the printing press changed everything and comics became a big thing. And I like that some of the two first comics were called A Harlot's Progress and A Rake's Progress. I was like, hell yeah, we know where our bread's buttered even back then.
You know what? Smut has always been a thing, man.
And also, tell me about the quote-unquote worst people. Tell me about...
That's where all the good stories are,
exactly,
man.
Yeah, like, you're not going to read, like, the rich diplomat who's set in his tea room all day. Like, that is a boring-ass story. I have no interest in it. And then it talks about the line between fine art versus comics. And this goes back a lot to what you were talking about. Why does it matter if it's in a museum or not? I actually think that Scott would agree with you on that in some respects.
I just don't understand. I guess
it's kind of like it doesn't need to be in a museum. It's kind of a shame, though, that it's not.
It deserves. Here's the thing: it deserves the respect.
Yeah.
But I don't think that a museum, and maybe this is. I don't dislike museums. I think that they can be fun to go to. I think that, like, it can be cool to look at.
Yeah.
But I don't think that I've ever been in a museum, and I don't go to art museums, but I don't think I've ever been in a museum and been like, well, this is the absolute paragon of everything that, like, a thing could be. And maybe it's just because
You're asking a lot of a museum, I'm going to go ahead and say.
Well, but if that's the case, then why is a museum, like, the thing that a thing has to aspire to?
Yeah, it's fair. A perfectly fair question, to which I do not have an answer. But yeah, he talks about the differences and similarities between fine art and comics, and how in the olden days you really couldn't tell the difference. Like, comics were drawn as if they were fine art because no one had decided they weren't yet.
Well, and also it takes time and practice, and I feel like art has only improved as people have gotten better understandings of things. So of course, like, the first pictures were, like, weird because, like, the printing press was garbage. Like,
yeah.
You know.
Yeah, that's fair.
Technology has improved. The way you get your art has improved.
Yes, absolutely. And then they talk about, like, stained glass windows that are sequential that tell a story. They talk about the photo booths, and something that I thought was interesting, and he says in some countries, photo comics are in fact quite popular. Well, he talks about Japanese comics later, but this made me think of Japan, because I assume it's still true today. It was true when I was there. Going into a photo booth with all your best friends and taking a bunch of pictures and then putting different, like, filters on it and telling little stories with your friends was huge there. And it would print out photos. It'd print out stickers that you could then take off and put on stuff. Yeah. Like, photo booth stories were huge in Japan when I was there, and I probably still are. Although maybe not, because now we have Snapchats and Instagrams and TikToks where you can put filters on and maybe do it that way. So I have no idea if they're even still around, and if anyone does, let me know.
Photo booths are, I don't know about Japan, but I know they're still popular enough in America because I've taken Sabia to them, and like she has quite a few of those little printed out things from the mall or whatever.
Yeah, absolutely. And then he talks about the difference between the sequence of one, like Far Side comics, Family Circus comics, comic strips from the. And he's like, well, those are more cartoons. Those are not the same things in their approach. Like because they're not sequential art. They don't fit our definition. So it's very weird to know that there are, on the comics page, the funny pages, as my grandfather used to call it, in the newspaper, there are things that are technically not comics. Then we move on, floating through space, like talking about how abstract and cosmic the entire world of comics. And basically at the end, he kind of gives a toast. He's like, here's to the great debate. Like, obviously my definition is not going to make everyone happy.
Right.
If this was 2023, he'd be like, please feel free to sound off in the comments. Is basically what he's saying there at the end of our chapter 1. Then we move on to chapter 2, the vocabulary of comics. This was really neat because he talks about, this is very funny, because it starts out with a picture of a pipe. And in French, it's a painting by Marguerite called The Treachery of Images. The inscription in French is translated means, this is not a pipe. And indeed, it's not a pipe. It's a painting of a pipe, right? Well, actually, that's wrong. This is not a painting of a pipe. This is drawing of a painting of a pipe. Ne sais pas? Nope, wrong again. It's a painting copy of a drawing of a painting of a pipe. 10 copies, actually. 6 if you fold the pages back. Do you hear what I'm saying? If you do have your ears checked, I haven't said a word. And that reminded me of how immersive comics are and how
we give voices in our heads to things.
Yeah, this chapter is a lot about icons.
Yeah.
And how the next page is just all these pictures of things with it written underneath that those aren't the things.
Yeah. It's he calls it amplification through simplification.
Yeah, which is, man, that's great. And he even talks about how his little avatar in this comic is very simple.
Yeah.
Because it becomes easier, he thinks it becomes easier to relate to and easier to get his message and not concentrate on his face. The more simple his face is, he can become the everyman.
Yeah.
That's out here giving you the information that you need. And the last panel on page 30, when we abstract an image through cartooning, we're not so much eliminating details as we are focusing on specific details. By stripping down an image to its essential meaning, an artist can amplify that meaning in a way that realistic art can't. I thought that was just lovely.
Yes, 100%.
Like, you take away all the extra, and then you pick what's most important. Like, if you look at a smiley face button, it's just 2 eyes and the smile. Like, that's all you need for a smile. Like, all the rest of it is superficial.
When you're amplifying what's important, I was actually... At first, I kind of disagreed with this notion because, like, I prefer manga, and I feel like a lot of that art is more heavily detailed. But when you're talking about amplifying what's important, the like heavy focus that a lot of Japanese art has on like the eyes and the way the different parts can be very detailed.
Yeah,
like it's an interest. I like it.
Yeah, although it is it also sort of still works with the stripping down the image. Because in a lot of manga, the eyes become really big and all the other features become really small.
Yeah.
So you are it's like, hey, I want you to pay attention to these eyes. So I made them fucking 4 stories tall, right? And I don't want you to pay attention to the body. So I made it on a big chibi head and a little very small body, because the expression on the face is what I want you to pay attention to. Also, something that Scott does on almost every page, and I know he planned it, and I know it probably took a fucking ton of work. And it's something that comics do in general. And I don't know if it's something that he really gets into too much, but it's important, so I'm going to mention it. He always makes a very strong point, like, right before you turn the page, so that it sticks with you. Like, while you're turning the page to get to the next thought, the last thing he said is, like, in your head. Mm-hmm. You're not just, like, when you read panel to panel, the thoughts are just cycling through your head. Like, you have to stop and take a moment if something hits you. But as you're turning the page, there's a pause programmed in by the way the comic is set up.
Yeah.
To make you stop there. Like at the bottom of page 31, he talks about the fact that your mind is capable of taking a circle, 2 dots, and a line and turning them into a face is nothing short of incredible. But still more incredible is the fact that you can't avoid seeing a face here. Your mind won't let you.
Yeah.
And as I was turning the page, I was like, holy shit, that man is right. Well, I see faces everywhere. It's terrifying.
I do actually have a slight bone to pick, because he makes, so on page 32, he makes faces out of squiggly lines, which is fine.
He makes little goopy little
But
guys.
then at the bottom of page 32, he says humans are a self-centered race. Mm-hmm. And we see ourselves in everything. I actually think he's factually incorrect here.
Okay.
Because I think that seeing faces in things is actually an evolutionary response to the fact that babies can't see very far.
Yeah.
And so they're always looking for the face of the person who's going to make sure they don't fucking die.
Right.
You know, I think it's a value judgment to consider humans self-centered, because we see faces in things, and I just think he's wrong about this. When I read it, I think it's something babies do, and it's because it's an evolutionary
You mean
response.
The most self-centered creatures on Earth?
I mean, if you decide to have one, then you're just completing the contract that you have given yourself. This is not the baby's fault. This is all on you. Yes. As someone with 2 children.
But there is a certain age when they start to learn to care about other people, and before that, it's all about them, baby.
Well, it is.
Them babies.
But they're supposed to be that way, because they have to try to survive. But
I'm not faulting them. I just think it's sort of interesting that the you're right. It is definitely evolution. The evolution that we see faces in everything, but we also make faces in everything, like media and what am I trying to think of? People who work on advertising. Yeah. They put faces on and in everything because they know it attracts our eyes. So even when we have the option to not do that, we still do that.
Well, it's just, but it's an evolutionary response. That was my main critique of this particular notion. I don't think it makes people self-centered. I just think it's a natural evolutionary response to the fact that when you are a small child, you're looking for a face. Right.
Because to make sure someone's looking out for you.
You don't want to die of starvation and in your own poop.
That's what I'm saying. Selfish. We're saying the same thing. We're just using different words. No, you are correct. And you are correct. And he probably might be... well, it
was 1990.
He seems like a really nice guy.
It was 1993. Yeah. Maybe we didn't really have the right kind of science for that kind of knowledge to be common.
Yeah, he actually, in 1988, he... did what was called the Creator Bill of Rights to help comic creators against being exploited by the comic companies they work for, like Marvel and DC. It didn't go anywhere, but it was a noble effort. Yeah. I think he's I hope he's not self-centered himself. I hope he's not projecting. I hope he's just been... I hope he's just been hurt a lot in his youth. I hope that's the case.
Like I said, I don't know if the knowledge might not have been common. I just wanted to make a point of pointing out that I think he was wrong in that particular instance. Yeah. But then he starts talking about masks. Yeah. And how, you don't see yourself. And I actually really like that notion that you see yourself in your mind, but you don't actually
When two people interact, they usually look directly at one another, seeing their partner's features in vivid detail. Each one also sustains a constant awareness of his or her own face, but this mind picture is not nearly as vivid. Just a sketch or arrangement, a sense of shape, a sense of general placement.
Yeah.
Is that what you mean?
Yeah.
Okay.
It's just really neat.
Because I had the same thing. I was talking about that, and it's also interesting. He talks about the message, using specifically Mickey Mouse and the Disney and Disney cartoons as an example, which I think is neat. The cartoon is a vacuum into which our identity and awareness are pooled. An empty shell that we inhabit, which enables us to travel into another realm. We don't just observe the cartoon, we become it. And I was like, whew. That one gave me the shivers. I was like, yeah, we become it.
Isn't that kind of what all stories do, though? I don't know. Maybe it's just me projecting, but like anytime I read a story, I tend to put myself in a character.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Well, he specifically uses himself as an example. He shows a picture of him as he, quote unquote, really looks.
More realistic.
Yeah, more realistic, at least. And he's like, hey, would you have listened to me if I looked like this? I doubt it. You would have been far too aware of the messenger to fully receive the message. So, yeah, like when you watch cartoons, it's easier to put yourself into the protagonist with... And I think it's different from literature because you don't have a visual element in literature except the one that you make in your own mind, where you're already going to ascribe yourself to certain characters and qualities.
He kind of disagrees with himself a little bit there, though, because if he was talking, like, he draws himself in a simple style, but he still gives himself features.
Yeah.
Whereas if he was just this face, like the circle... Like on page 37?
Well, yeah, he actually does put a little just a face in front of him.
Like, if...
I think somewhere, I don't know if it's right here, but somewhere he does talk about, like, there's a diminishing returns on that eventually, where you get down to, it's like, relatable, now it's just a smiley face icon. Now it's unrelatable again. And I don't know if he mentions it here, but he does talk about how, like, that face works... to a certain extent. And again, you're right. He doesn't come to a finite conclusion on this. He very much comes to a, like, well, you gotta decide for yourself. Yeah, different artists do a different way.
And different people probably relate to different pictures.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah.
There's a reason why
otherwise
He-Man,
there would only be
There's a reason why He-Man and Batman and stuff are big and bulky and have muscles and really defined chin lines.
Yeah. There's a audience that like that and expect him to look that way.
Yeah. I also really... What was this? I like the way he explains that, like, these ideas have the life that we give them, basically.
Yeah, I thought that was a really good message. And he is talking about the different ways artists use it. How some artists decide to take a relatively simple character and put them on an extremely complicated background. Mm-hmm. And then sometimes you have a very complicated character on a very simple background, and how that creates an entirely different emotional bearing and puts you in an entirely different place. In here, he mentions Dave Sim and Gerard, who do Cerebus. He mentions Japan. The masking effect was, for a time, virtually a national style. Thanks to the seminal influence of comic creator Osamu Tezuka, Japanese comics have a long, rich history of iconic character. But in recent decades, Japanese fans also developed a taste for flashy, photorealistic art. So it's interesting he talks about how much cross-pollination there is between America and Japan that started as early as after World War II, when we were helping them rebuild because some jerks bombed them. I don't know the details. But... After
not important.
Yeah, not important. After the bombings, America, and the kindness of our hearts, came in and helped Japan rebuild. And during that time, there was a lot of cross-pollination between Japanese ideas and American ideas. They started discovering our comics for the first time. We started discovering theirs. Same for animation. Astro Boy, their first real animated hit, was a direct response to Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs. These things were all connected. Page 45, we got
honorary
a
mouse
drop. Yeah, same. I made a note that there's a mouse drop. Which, in 2 weeks' time, we will be back on to finish up. So
we decided to do a little nice...
Yeah, and something that I feel like will help us. Not just with Mouse, but in the future, all comics that we get into.
Here, this is what... So on page 46, he says the scale shows several different, slightly different progressions.
Yeah.
And then he has different, like like a chart about how complex and realistic and...
Objective, subjective, specific, universal. They're all on a scale.
Yep.
Meaning retained, resemblance gone. Words are the ultimate abstraction. Most American comics, notably comic books, have long emphasized the differences between words and pictures. But then he's like, but how different are there? And then he starts to show different ways that they can come together. And page 48 and 49 I fucking loved.
Yeah.
Because he talked about the struggle between, in comic books, which you kind of only have in comics, at least as far as written goes, a struggle between an artist and a writer. Yeah. Like an artist and a writer both have things they want to say and ways that they want to express. And I love the idea. At the very beginning, it shows them shaking hands. They're right next to each other. And then they go off to their separate, workshops to work on their stuff. And then when they meet back together, it shows like a huge gulf between them. Yeah. Because what the artist wants out of a comic and what the writer wants out of a comic, even if they're trying to tell the same story, they're going to try and do it in two totally different ways. Yeah. It's like when you're a hammer, everything looks like a nail. Like if you're an artist, like I have to tell the story with my panels, and if you're a writer, you're like I have to tell the story with my words.
I did make a point of like I do think, in all honesty, to a certain extent, comics are probably the most difficult thing to make to try to convey things because I think a book or just a picture, you can convey whatever, like you can. Whatever you want to say, you can try to find a way to say in just that picture. Yeah. And in a book, you're entrusting the audience to make pictures for themselves. Or, however your brain decides to interpret what you're reading. Yeah. Whereas with a comic, you've got to find this balance of, like, how much do you say with each thing? Yeah. And it is just, I don't think... I mean, I agree with his overall theory that comics don't get the respect they deserve. Yeah. I think it has to... I don't know about you, but when I write stuff, I do have a very specific thing in my head that I'm trying to put into words. Yeah. And I think that that's, in a certain extent, a little bit easier because you're entrusting the people who read the thing you write to make their own thing in their head.
I think there's some truth to that, but I also think, ironically... You would think it would be the opposite. Because with a comic, you have two different tools in your toolbox to convey your message. But the problem is, unless you are both writer and artist, and of course they're out there, but if you are collaborating with another person who works in a totally different genre... Yes. And, people that are doing movies have to do this all the time. Yeah. You've got the guy who's doing the musical score, the guy that's, like, doing the, who's actually drawing the storyboard. You have the actors, you have the set designer. Like, in that, you have hundreds of people getting together to try and make one singular image. You have producers and directors at the top kind of steering the ship. But, I don't know, comics, like, if you get someone that you... vibe with and you both have the same image, it's probably as difficult as co-writing. Like if you and I tried to co-do a comic or co-write a book, we would probably run into a lot of the same difficulties because at the end of the day it's about making my image and your image meet in the middle in a way that we're both happy with. It probably is a little harder in comics because you're also talking different mediums. Like if I'm the artist and you're the writer. As someone who just tried to write a comic and describe the panels as they were going to exist. It was hard. I don't know if it was harder than writing books, because I've also failed to do that. I would have to finish one before I could decide which was harder.
I wrote some fan fiction, and as far as I'm concerned, that counts.
Yeah, absolutely. If I had finished a short story at any point in my life, that would have counted.
I've published on FFN a handful of fanfics, so but I do think to a certain extent, I know what I want something to look like. And I don't know, I guess maybe it depends on how much of a perfectionist the person who's creating the thing is. But I'd imagine that if you're a person who writes comics for the world to see, you're a little bit of a perfectionist.
Yeah.
You want...
That's fair.
You want things to look a very specific kind of way.
Yeah.
And I think that that's kind of harder, to be honest. I don't know about... I can't speak for movies and stuff. But yeah. I do think that that's difficult.
It very well might be. Like I say, I would have to finish some. I have finished short stories. Like let's set the record straight. I've written some short stories.
I didn't say you didn't.
I said I didn't, and I felt self-conscious about it. And I actually had to go back and set the record straight because one of our listeners is going to diss me for having never. I've finished some short stories. Thank you. They've all been published in my head. So then Scott McCloud talks about the picture plane, reality, and meaning as 3 points in a pyramid. And he has a beautiful 2-page spread with like 120 different comic artists and where they fall on this pyramid.
Yeah.
And it's fucking huge. And it's very funny because at the bottom there's a little panel of him going, read it later. Like, don't stop and like examine this right now.
I did stop and examine this because you don't tell me what to do, Scott.
I did. I glanced. Like, I looked at a few of the heads and was like, ooh, I like that one. Who did that? And then but I did eventually moved on because I had a deadline to meet. But, yeah, just about, I mean, any artist from the 90s and backwards who you would recognize from Europe, America, Japan, couple others who fall into the other categories. Yeah, they're pretty much all 120 of them at least. The top 120 are represented here and where they would fall in this on this art stylings, which I really dig. And yeah, that 2-page spread is worth the price of buying Understanding Comics by itself. Not to mention it was published in 92, so you can get it in used bookstores for like $3.
It is a really interesting pyramid to make.
Yeah. Well, he spends like much more patience on it. This is very important. It's one of the art defining things that he uses to express how art works.
Yeah.
And there's a couple of panels here I want to read. It's top of page 57. When an artist is drawn to one end of the chart or another, that artist may be revealing something about his or her strongest values and loyalties in art. Those who approach the lower left, for example, are probably attracted by a sense of the beauty of nature. Those at the top by the beauty of art. And those on the right by the beauty of ideas. For a comic to mature as a medium, it must be capable of expressing each artist's innermost needs and ideas. But each artist has different inner needs of different points of view, different passions, and so needs to find different forms of expressions. At the bottom it says, check out Wassily Kandinsky's terrific 1912 essay on the problem of form, which I did not do. Shame on me. Nice work. Thank God. One of us takes this seriously.
Well, I looked it up, and then it looked really dense, and I decided that I don't have the proper credentials to be involved in that.
Well, so hey, at least you have enough self-esteem to look it up. I assumed I didn't have the credentials before I even got that far, so kudos to you. But I think there was something neat because he talks about the people who concentrate on language, like the beauty of ideas. The people who are on the picture planet are talking about the beauty of art. And the people in reality are talking about the beauty of nature. And I'm sure that's not always true. Like, some people just have a natural ability to draw in a certain style, and therefore that's the style they draw in. But they wish they could do a different style.
Yeah.
But I think to a certain extent, there's probably some truth in that. That the way you draw does say a lot about you. Because, yeah, are you interested in ideas, nature, or beauty, or trying to be in the middle where you're capturing all three? And man, as someone who can't draw at all, I would settle for any one of those.
Also, me too.
Yeah.
I agree with you completely.
Aw.
It's a very, like I said, it's a very interesting pyramid. It's neat. way of examining the comic, like the concept of comics.
Yeah. And that's the thing I think Scott McCloud does really well, is makes me look at comics in ways that I had never thought to. Yeah. Like putting it on, you can take a comic and put it on a spectrum with any 3 points. But those 3 particular points, maybe if I had been in art school, I would have thought of that. But at no point would I have thought of that based on the knowledge that I'm walking into this.
On page...
Oh, chapter 3.
Yep.
Blood in the Gutters. What do you have?
Well, on page 60, he's talking about when he was very young, I had a reoccurring daydream that the whole world was just a show put on for my benefit. That unless I was present to see things, they just ceased to exist. And I really like this because I really like the idea that everything has only existed since last Tuesday. That's my favorite one of these kind of thoughts. Yeah. That, like, everything we think of as in the past before last Tuesday isn't real. You made all that up in your own... I love that notion.
I think it should be noted that Scott McCloud came up with The Truman Show in 1993, years before it actually happened.
He should get credit for that.
But he has a very picture of him as a little kid walking, and like there's nothing behind him. And when he turns back, there's stuff behind him and nothing in front of him.
Yep.
Like the world is just coming into being and
around him.
Around him. And isn't that how...
he's a child.
A lot of us think, especially as children. Yeah. And Blood in the Gutter is my favorite chapter. It talks about the thing that happens between panels.
Yep.
And he talks because our eyes have a way of observing parts that we can't see.
Yes.
Called closure. And he has a really good example of, it's a line of Pepsi bottles on a wall. And of course, each one's turned a little bit, so you can only see certain parts of it.
Yes.
But your mind is committing closure on the rest of the bottles based on the bottles you can see, assuming that all of the labels look exactly the same. And he talks about how closure and our imaginations combine to determine what happens between 2 panels.
Mm-hmm. I actually really like the line. I think we can see a difference in what he's talking about, actually, in the way we read this, because I focus on these words.
Yeah.
Our perception of reality is based on an act of faith. I thought that was actually the most interesting part of this.
That scares my atheist soul.
Well, because we can't... He makes a point because we can't perceive everything that happens.
Right.
So we have to just take it on faith that other things exist. Like, you can't just believe that only the stuff you can see is real.
Yeah.
Because there's stuff that you can't see, and it's still real. Like, you don't...
We must depend on closure for our very survival.
Yeah.
And sometimes a mere shape or outline is enough to trigger closure. And it shows a quarter with 2 dimes on it, and it's making the Disney Mickey Mouse ears.
Yeah.
And you know, your mind pops to that. And then he shows this picture that is a reoccurring image of a guy, like, tipping his top hat. And he's like, we're talking about the changes in time and motion between those 2 panels. Between the panel of him with the hat on and him taking the hat off, in the gutter, in the area between those 2 panels, you are assuming that he lifted his hat up. You have committed closure between those 2 panels to get from point A to point V.
Your mind makes the progression without seeing it actually happen.
Yeah. And the best panel he's got is, there's a panel with a guy with an axe chasing a guy, and he's like, "No, you die!" And the other guy's like, "No!" And then the next panel is the city, like, at night, and you just see, someone yelling. That's a great, So it's someone yelling. And he's like, "Man, what a horrible thing that artist did to kill that guy." Actually, the artist didn't kill him. You killed him. You decided what happened between those 2 panels. Like, he just set it up. You knocked it down. That's all on you, baby. You did that. And I was like, "Aw, that made me feel bad." Closure in comic fosters an intimacy surpassed only by the written word, a silent, secret contract between creator and audience. How the creator honors that contract is a matter of both art and craft. Occasionally I will just read quotes from this book and have absolutely nothing to add to it. Just things that made my heart sing about the art of comics. He gives some examples of different things. Different ways.
Transitions.
Yeah. Subject to subject, scene to scene, action to action, moment to moment. And he gives examples of each one.
Moment to moments are like people blinking or,
us moving closer to a planet or a spider slowly crawling up someone.
And action to action focuses a lot on like people's movements.
Yeah, subjects in distinct action to action progression, like a guy hitting a ball with a bat,
running a car into 2 or 3.
Like you do.
Like you do. Well, honestly, if that had been a curve, it really would be like I do.
Subject to subject, we're staying within a scene or idea. Note the degree of reader involvement necessary to render different transactions meaningful. We have the one with the axe in the city. Mm-hmm. And then we have a guy said, what more could go wrong? And a girl in the next panel says, well, at least Jerry never called. And then you have a scene of the phone ringing.
Yep.
Which us as the audience is like, well, that's fucking Jerry.
Jerry has called.
Jerry has called. Deductive reasoning is the often required in reading comics. And this one's talking about scene-to-scene transitions, which transport us across significant distances of time and space. And then there's a guy on the phone saying he can't outrun us forever. And then it says 10 years later showing a house. And it's like, okay, well, this is when he stopped being able to outrun them.
The fifth type is aspect to aspect, which bypasses time for the most part and sets wandering eyes on different aspects of a place, idea, or mood. So, like, setting a scene, basically.
Yeah.
You got Christmas and Santa.
Yeah.
Yeah,
all things happening at the same time within the same...
Yep.
area. And then my favorite, the non sequitur, which offers pictures with no relationship between them whatsoever.
We just got some random ass shit going on here.
Random ass shit. And then we mentioned Jack Kirby, who is an artist for which anyone who reads Marvel Comics will know, and kind of talks about why Jack Kirby has his real well-earned reputation. He started the trend that became huge.
I just wrote down for this part, because we're on page like 75.
Yeah.
I just wrote down for this part, ooh, I love charts.
Yeah.
Like, this is different, like, the taking the comics apart by, like, which transitions they use the most often.
Mm-hmm. And talking about an interesting amount of similarities between different artists and different styles. But then he starts talking... European style, also very similar. Mm-hmm. And then, before we conclude that type, 2 to 4 have monopoly on straightforward storytelling. Let's take a look at another, at Osamu Tezuka from Japan. He is a far cry from the early Spiegelman. His storytelling is clear and straightforward, but look at how he charts. So this is talking about the difference between Japanese... Mm-hmm. Tracking versus and how they transition scenes to American artists.
Yes.
And the next few pages are all about that, which I found very interesting.
Yes.
The cultural differences are many. And
they have different types of frames. Like, he makes a point of he talks about it a little bit later, but talking about the way, because like on page 79, like these borders are all like sort of, they're different than the other borders that are used because it's conveying a different meaning. Yeah.
They also do a lot more with either tall, and I don't know if he mentions this, but it's just something I've known from reading manga. Tall rectangles and long rectangles. Mm-hmm. Like, they do rectangle work in manga. Yeah,
they do a lot of aspect to aspect transitions because they use a lot more space. Like, to kind of set the mood as opposed to action shots, basically.
Yes. Even sequences, while still an issue, seem far less important here than in other transitions. Rather than acting as a bridge between separate moments, the reader here must assemble a single moment using scattered fragments.
Yeah.
And then he talks about his personal reasoning of why he thinks that might be. And I like that he's just like, hey, I'm just throwing this out as a theory. I'm a stupid gaijin. I don't know. I'm just throwing a guess out based on my exposure, which I thought was really neat.
Yeah, on page 81, he says, traditional Western art and literature don't wander much. On the whole, we're a pretty goal-oriented culture, but in the East, there's a rich tradition of cyclical and labyrinth works of art. Japanese comics may be heirs to this tradition in the way that they so often emphasize being there over getting there.
Yeah, which is, man, again, very nice. Very nice. And they even goes back and starts talking about the idea that elements omitted from a work of art are as much a part of that work as those included has been a specialty of the East for centuries. Mm-hmm. And then it shows the famous Japanese wave pictures and talks about how it's a relationship of negative space. And if you turn it over, it's a wave in the sky. And if you turn it over, it's still wave in sky. And they form kind of a yin-yang shape. And I thought that was just chef's kiss. A thing that I've seen that wave a million fucking times. Like, I have postcards with that wave. I have art books with that wave.
I'm about to say,
the yin-yang thing of fucking
I vaguely recall
soared over my head.
When my mother was going through her Buddhist phase, that there was a book of Zen, like, meditation things that had that fucking picture on the front of it. Like...
yeah. And then he starts talking about minimalism and how that's an art style all that's on and it has just as much merit as anything else. I love on the second panel in the middle on page 83. And say, what do you think this painting by Al Held is called? And it's just a white painting with two little black triangles in the center at the top and bottom. And it's called The Big N. And when you hear the name of the painting, you can see it and you're like, oh, Jesus Christ. That seems more like a joke for the newspaper than a piece of art. But once again, who am I to judge? The mastery of any medium using minimal elements has long been considered a noble aspiration. And then he starts talking. He tells a story about a guy dying from drunk driving. And he talks about all the different ways to tell the story. Yeah. And like, you can do it with 30 panels, 15 panels, 10 panels, 5 panels, etc. And then he goes to where he doesn't have any art at all, and it's just words. Mm-hmm. And he's like, what story am I telling now? And just a lot of very interesting different ways that art can be used. And then he talks about how comics can also engage your other senses besides sight. Mm-hmm. Like, because of onomatopoeias, you can have sound. And you can, if you see... a pot of steaming vegetables with like the steam coming off it, you can actually smell it.
Yeah, your brain fills in what you don't actually have any other, like your brain fills in these things. It's the closure like he was talking about earlier.
Yeah, like when he was talking about how he's like, oh, did you hear what I said? Oh, I didn't say anything. Ha ha ha. Like he's bringing that home here. Yes. At the bottom of page 92, he's talking about the visible and the invisible. This dance is unique to comics. No other art form gives so much to its audience while asking so much from them as well. Mm-hmm. This is why I think it's a mistake to see comics as a mere hybrid of the graphic arts and prose fiction. What happens between these panels is a kind of magic only comics can create. And, another one just made my heart sing. Onward to chapter 4, talking about time frames. Now, I didn't have a lot about this chapter. It very interestingly is just... It's very interesting. It's talking about the power of panels and time traveling through panels and how comics can use that to great effect and use it in different ways. Mm-hmm. But I feel like unless I was doing a comic, which I currently am not.
Unless I was doing an
art. It felt more of just like, oh, that's kind of interesting. Yeah. This was the chapter that I kind of I took the least from. Oh, it's not a bad chapter, not at all. It's just the one that I was like, okay, it's about time.
I did like, so like on page 101, he has 3 different shots of the same panel.
Page 101, the power of panels. Yeah, I'm right there with you. Hey. Please, continue.
And he's got on the top of the page has the same dude in the same position for 3 separate panels, and then an answer to the question of, do you think the Sox could finally do it this year? Which I guess is a sports thing. And then they got the same thing, but only 3 panels as opposed to 5. And it's a very, I really do like, on the last one it's got just a longer middle panel and 2 smaller ones.
Still 3 panels, but the middle panel's got a lot of length to it now. As unlikely as it sounds, the panel shape can actually make a difference in our perception of time. Even though this long panel has the same basic meaning as the shorter version, still has the feeling of greater length. Because
100%.
your eyes have to move across
Yes.
it. Yeah. I thought that was... I also noted that was really good.
And then on page 103, he talks about how in Japanese mangas, there was typically, like, there's less of a border on some of the pages that end... And this made me think of Sandman, and how there's that page where everything's just kind of floating through the dreaming.
Yeah.
And the complete lack of panels, and how that really creates the whole entire sort of mood of just, like, drifting along.
Yeah, and you're not being hemmed in by space anymore. Like, whenever they go to Destiny's Garden, it's almost never paneled. It's almost always wide open, which I think is to try and show that infinite of time and space.
Yeah.
Yeah, definitely. I didn't connect it, even though on page 103 it kind of looks like Destiny's Garden that they're walking through. I did not connect it till you brought it up just now.
Yeah, he's just talking about timeless spaces and how the lack of borders makes everything sort of feel more like that.
Yeah. He goes a step further, and on the bottom of page 105, I wrote the most relatable comic I've ever read. He's talking about, conditioned as we are to read left to right and up to down, a mischievous cartoonist can play any number of tricks on us. And it's about a guy who doesn't have money, and he's like, oh, I'll just borrow it from myself in the future. And he's got like a fishing rod, and he hooks the money and goes to a restaurant. But then when he opens his wallet, there's no money in it because it got hooked from the panel above it. You have to look at the bottom page 105 because I can't really explain it properly, but
it is beautiful.
It's panel work made to subvert our expectations, which I'm there for. And then he talks more about panel shape and how panel shapes can dictate time, showing us a vertical sunrise, which again, then he starts talking about how it dictates motions. And how hard artists tried to, once moving pictures came out, like both painters and comic artists both like immediately started trying to capture motion.
Yep.
Instead of just being content in their own shit.
Page 108 gets an honorary fuck Thomas Edison.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Thomas Edison, what a douche. That old scallywag. Even Scott, who seems like a super nice guy, had to call him a scallywag because man, fuck him.
They start talking about motion lines and all of this stuff, and I just wrote down my Yahweh loving self knows all about motion lines.
Oh yeah. Well, he even on page 114 we get back to Japan where he starts talking about the difference between American and Japanese motion and how it works, which I thought was really interesting. He talks about what is in motion versus I'm going to say camera, but you know what I mean. From where you're viewing the panel from. Yeah, your perspective. Thank you. And that part was really cool. The fact it presents to the reader is one of simple normality, or the illusion of it anyway. All depends on your frame of mind. Talking about how we're just trying to make time. We're just trying to make time pass.
And you're trying to make time flat.
Yeah.
Which is the difficult part of it, almost.
One dare say impossible, but comics do a damn good job.
They do. They really do.
Chapter 5, Living in the Lines. Can emotions be made visible, is the question that he asks. And we've got some abstract art here that he asks, oh, is this a good representation of pride, serenity, joy, anger, anxiety, madness? And to a lot of them, I say yes.
The only one that really resonated with me was Loud.
Oh, Madness definitely did, because when I was a kid, that's how I used to draw crazy people when I would draw kids as a comic. When I was a kid and I would do comics, those were their eyes. I'd do like the squiggles.
See, I'd do eyebrows.
Like a spiral, and the spiral instead of eyes, and it made them quote-unquote crazy. But yeah, I definitely got angered because it looked like broken glass. Serenity kind of looked like an island in the sea. Anxiety made me feel anxious. I think
these pictures would have been helped with color. But maybe that's just me, because maybe I draw more from... Like I said, Loud was the only one out of all of these abstract notions...
That worked for you?
That worked for me.
I definitely got a lot of these. Like I said, Rank didn't work for me, and Pride didn't work for me. But the rest of them I got. But anyway, he's talking about them and talks about how fine arts started this art style that eventually, hey, guess what? Comics adopted.
All of these things build on each other.
Absolutely.
I think part of the problem with the way a lot of... Oh, no, I did not. Just deleted all my notes. I think part of the problem with the way...
All right.
I think a lot of the problem with the way things are interpreted is that we automatically assume things have to be in conflict with each other.
Mm-hmm.
I don't think that's necessarily fair.
Yeah. Well, I think he's trying to say that they're built upon each other. It's like we go to fine arts to see how they did it, and then we see how artists kind of took that and moved in different... Sometimes they complemented it, and sometimes they moved in different directions. On page 126, the second row, the first two panels, in the mid-1960s, when the average Marvel reader was pre-adolescent, popular inkers used dynamic but friendly lines, a la Kirby. But when Marvel's reader base grew into the anxieties of adolescence, the hostile, jagged lines of a Rob Liefeld struck a more responsive chord. So, I started reading comics in the 90s, and I distinctly remember the difference between those comics and the ones when I would go and pick up old issues.
Yeah.
Because in the 90s, everything got jagged. Also, they got a lot more pouches, a lot more guns, and a lot more boobs. The ladies, man, a lot less clothes, a lot more boobs. That was the 90s anxiety adolescents. They knew their audience. They were like, how do we get the adolescents to read our comic books? It turned out the answer was jagged lines and boobs. Who would have thunk?
Yeah, no, that makes sense. I don't know. I didn't really get into comics until I was older.
Mm-hmm.
But I've always preferred Japanese art.
Yeah.
Or even actually Korean. Like, I've really gotten into Korean mangas and stuff as well. So yeah. I don't have the reference for this that...
It's again, came out in 93, so it's definitely a thing that a lot of people who came later did not live through the struggle. But there's a lot of things that art-wise we take for granted, like heart's meaning and love, the heart shape.
Yeah, the symbols.
The flies and the stink lines around trash. Like, oh, I know that trash smells.
Mm-hmm.
And you move it to anything else. You move it to a dog, oh, that dog smells. Move it to a guy, oh, that guy smells. You have the lightning bolts to show pain, the birds and the stars to show, someone's been conked out. And then they show, once again, we get a cut to Asian culture versus, European American comic culture. And talk about the way they show sleep and lust and anger and dementia and ways that just developed there because...
They were isolated.
So
and they
came
had their
up
own...
Yeah, they came up with their own thing. He finishes talking about how you form the words. Like, you can make the word burr, and you can also make the word look like it's shivering to dictate cold. You can also use these shapes in the background of a scene to show someone slowly going crazy or whatever.
Yeah.
Or you can use the words to say, I just want you to know that I'm going crazy. And he's like, well, together, of course, words and pictures can work miracles. But we'll get to that in the next chapter. And we do. Chapter 6, Show and Tell. Which starts with a...
little boy showing off his robot.
Yeah, which I thought was very cute.
It's a Transformer robot. It turns into an airplane.
Yeah, it's an airplane now. And he starts like, we all start out like this, didn't we? Using words and image interchangeably. Mm-hmm. Because during it, he talks about it a little, and then he stops and shows things that it can do. And then he talks about how words and images interchangeably have often been the world of advertisements, and have been considered crass commercialism, and therefore of no artistic merit. But then we crawl into a cave and look at some cave paintings and some Egyptian and some
indigenous kind of art.
Yeah, from Japan and from Egypt and from South America. Talking about stylized pictures. didn't take long, though, relatively speaking, before ancient writing started to become more abstract. Some written languages survive to this day, bearing traces of their ancestral pictorial heritage. Which I thought was it was a no-duh moment for me, but when I heard it, I was like, oh yeah, of course. It all started as pictures that eventually became sounds, that eventually became...
So, words and pictures, and on page 143, he said, words and pictures did still coexist in this stage of Western civilization, but those instances become the exception, not the rule. And he's still talking about the history of comics, and one of the things, like I told you earlier, that I kind of think he missed, and maybe it's just because it was 1993, is I kind of think he missed how much white supremacy plays in the notion of what we consider cultured and not. And I had a big whole spiel about this on my notes, which I deleted like a fucking idiot. But I do think that a lot of what culturally makes comics seem like they're less, outside of the fact that they're not in museums, is that we don't consider a lot of those cultures, like the indigenous cultures and the ancient Eastern cultures and even like ancient Egypt and shit, we don't really consider them civilized. Yeah. And there's a lot of judgment and like, I had this all wrote out all pretty. I'm so disappointed. But there's a lot of...
You're killing it. Keep going.
Again, it's 1993, and I feel like a lot of the understandings that we have developed recently in examining white supremacy and the way it affects our cultures weren't really as popular or as well known at this point in time. But I do think that comics are a good example of white supremacy in action and how that can affect things in ways we don't always see at first glance. How about that?
Okay. On page 150, he says, in fact, the general public's perception of great art and great writing hasn't changed much in 150 years. Any artist wishing to do great work in a medium using words and pictures will have to contend with this attitude, in others and in themselves, because deep inside, many comic creators still measure art and writing by different standards, and act on the faith that great art and great writing will combine harmoniously by virtue of quality alone. I think some of what you said is in that statement about how it hasn't changed in 150 years.
Yeah.
Certainly through the lens of, a writer from, I think he was born in Boston, Massachusetts. Massachusetts.
Well, I mean, he is also a white man. Like, it is...
Yeah, most definitely. But he is talking about the gulf. The end point, I think, is still very much valid. Like, the idea of great art and great writing, you can just do them separately and then smush them together and end up with a great comic. Like, two great tastes don't always taste great together. And everything's not going to be chocolate and peanut butter. Like, sometimes you're going to have, raspberry jam and soy sauce. Two great tastes that don't work together. And...
Well, and it's just, there's a notion culturally that, like, when you grow up, you're not going to need pictures in your books. Like, there's a idea that, like...
he mentions that for sure. About how as you get older, you're supposed to put childish things,
pages back,
like pictures away.
Well, and it's just the notion that a learned person will be able to read dense, frankly boring shit, and that is what makes you cultured and civilized. It's almost like you're not supposed to enjoy what you're doing.
No, you're supposed to be better than yourself so you can make more money.
If
you're not reading a book about how to fucking get Bitcoin to work for you,
oh my God,
then what are you even doing here? Move to one of those countries that likes art. All right. If it can't make you money, what value does it even have?
But that is white supremacy and patriarchy and capitalism.
Capitalism writ large.
This is the leftist part of the podcast.
Well, thank God. I was starting to think we didn't have it anymore. You deleted your notes, and I was so like, sad. You might have deleted leftism with it.
I got rid of all of it. I am the carrier.
But then he talks about the curse of being judged by the standards of the old, and he talks about how through every time a new invention would come along, people would fucking push back.
Have you ever seen the people who used to complain about people reading their books in public spaces? Because then you're not talking to people. It's the same complaint about phones.
There's some stand-up comedian, I don't remember who he is, but he had a skit about eating at a Waffle House, and he's reading a book, and someone was like, "What? Looks like we got us a reader here." And it's a whole long, relatively funny skit. I think Dan Harmon, maybe. I don't fucking know. But the skit itself was quite funny. But yeah, it says, ever since the invention of the written word, new media has been misunderstood. And somebody's talking, he's like, "Careful, Jacob, you keep doing this, you'll stop using your memory." And the idea that if you read too much, your memory will go to pot.
Yes.
And same happened when radio came, same when TV came, same with the internet came. Like, this is definitely a fucking reoccurring theme. And
new technology scares old people.
Yeah, absolutely. Like,
someday we'll be those old people.
God, someday, yeah. Not already.
He doesn't complain about TikTok or anything.
No, I don't. I'm a strong supporter. Word-specific combinations where pictures illustrate but don't signify add to a large complete text. Picture-specific combinations where words do little more than add a soundtrack. He's talking about the different ways that words and pictures work together. Duo-specific panels in which both words and pictures send essentially the same message.
Those are my least favorite kind of thing.
Another type is the additive combination, where words amplify the elaborateness of an image or vice versa. In parallel combination, words and pictures seem to follow very different courses without intersecting. Think the non-sequential again.
Yeah.
Still another option is the montage, where words are treated as integral parts of the picture, which you don't see a lot of, but yeah. Perhaps the most common type of word-picture combinations is interdependent, where words and pictures go hand in hand to convey an idea that neither could convey alone. So, obviously, that's going to be your most...
He does on the bottom of page 155, he has a scale, which is trying to talk about the balance of how much each thing explains, almost.
Yeah, the more the picture explains, the less you need words. The more words explain, the less you need pictures.
Yep.
Yeah. Yeah. And he's talking about how artists and writers work best together, and talks about telling a story with about a woman going home and eating ice cream after getting hit on by a creepy dude. Again, 1993. Even then, Scott knew what was up.
Yep.
And the mingling of words and pictures, which I like. Like, she's holding up the ice cream, and there's words on the ice cream, but there's also descriptions of what's happening next to the ice cream. And one of them exists within the world, and then one of them doesn't. And I think that's an important distinction that any artist who's working on this kind of stuff would tell you about.
On page 161, he's talking about how this is an exciting time to be making comics, and he feels very lucky to be born when I was. Still, I do feel a certain vague longing for that time over 50 centuries ago when to tell was to show and to show was to tell.
And that was another bottom of the page where he's like, you got to sit with that one for a second.
Yep.
Also, the end of chapter 6. We move on to chapter 7, the 6 steps. These are the 6 steps. There seems innocuous enough now. There was a time when such a simple idea was ridiculed. And properties that comics share with all other art forms. Even today, there are those who ask the questions, can comics be art? I'm sorry, it's a really stupid question. But if we want to answer, the answer is yes. So, he starts talking about art, as I see it, as any human activity which doesn't grow out of either of our species' 2 basic instincts, survival and reproduction. Which, again, he admits that definition of art by him is extremely broad.
It is.
But then he starts to explain all the different ways.
I actually kind of disagree, though, because I think a lot of art is about... I think a lot of what people do is about creating community. Yeah. And part of the way you do that is you tell stories. Mm-hmm. And you, like, continue...
So you're saying art might actually have a
value beyond...
Well, he says survival and reproduction. I guess it would be survival of keeping the unit together.
And you're sharing...
the clan together.
Humans don't have... Like, you know, like I don't want to call it a baser instinct, but like birds are born knowing how to fly. Right? We don't have that. We're not born knowing how to make fire.
No.
You have to be taught that. And I think stories are a way to teach people things.
I mean, don't they have to slap us in the ass so we figure out how to breathe when we're born?
No.
Why do they slap you on the butt?
I have had 2 children, and neither one of them have been slapped on the ass. I probably would have killed a doctor.
I thought that was how you got them to take their first breath. You had to make them cry or something.
No.
Maybe that's from, like, the 1950s sex ed videos our school gave us.
I know that... I think maybe if it's a C-section baby, you have to worry about something like that. But I think when you're born vaginally... Mm-hmm. Because neither one of my kids got hit. But when you're born vaginally, I think the pressure of just coming out kind of does that for you. It helps you.
See, I learned something today.
But yeah, I do think...
Maybe doctors just like slapping babies.
I do think that stories actually do play a part of survival.
Yeah. Well, his example here is very, very funny. He's talking about... he does this whole story with a caveman. Mm-hmm. Chasing a woman and then gets chased by a saber-toothed tiger. And he, like, tricks the tiger into running off a cliff. And he's standing at the edge of the cliff. He's like, his next move might be to look for food, survival, or perhaps another female, reproduction. But instead, and it's him making a face. And then it's just a picture of Scott going, art.
Art.
Again, this guy thinks making facial expressions at saber-toothed tigers you've outwitted counts as art. And,
but see, I think if you're considering, like, people aren't islands. So, like, if you consider community, let's say this is the first dude to get chased by a saber-toothed tiger. He would go back and tell the story of the tiger to the other people around the
which would help
campfire.
Educate them about how to avoid a tiger.
Yeah.
And he does show the camp and all the different people making art at the camp.
Yeah,
that at first
pictures.
Appears to just be them fucking off.
Yeah.
Yeah. He says, because of its independence from our evolution-bred instincts, which again, Cecilia disagrees with.
I do.
Art is the way we assert our identities as individuals and break out of the narrow roles nature cast us in. Of course, the genius of Mother Nature is such that even these things do have their uses from an evolutionary standpoint. Even Scott disagrees with Scott and agrees with you. 3, in fact. And then he talks about the ways he thinks... basically what Cecilia was saying, just a page later. Scott eventually realizes that Cecilia was right all along.
As most people should.
And yeah, he talks about a very interesting story about, are you doing it for money? And he tells stories of different people and how far they get with idea, purpose, form, idiom, structure, craft, and surface, which are the 6 steps that were mentioned. And he tells a very interesting story about an artist getting to each of those 6 steps and stopping, and where that gets you in the art world, which I thought was really, really, really cool. Like a really, really nice version. Very inclusive. Like we have a white man, an Asian woman, a black man, a white woman. Everybody gets a little further down the trail, and he talks about, hey, surprise, surprise, money sort of corrupts the fucking system and makes it a little harder.
Yeah, the things that I would like to eventually, hopefully at any point, actually do finish anything that I've started as far as my writing projects go. Cross your fingers and say a prayer for me, people.
Yeah.
But I want to create stuff that other people enjoy.
Yeah.
Like,
that's sort of my first thing.
I want fandoms that, like...
You were talking about TikTok, and I was like, I wanted to make a TikTok that says, look, I didn't get into podcasting for the money, and I have achieved that goal.
Well, it's just, I want to create
I have surpassed it. I've actually sunk money into this.
As someone who spends a lot of time in fandoms, I like the idea of creating stuff just for other people to enjoy the thing that I've created.
Yeah.
I want fan works. I want people to write fan fiction about the stupid story that I wrote. You know, like, I want that.
Yes. Abso-fucking-lutely.
It isn't very interesting, the different ways that he talks about what people have created.
Yeah, I like it really, and I suggest that you You were supposed to read it before you got... Now I sound like the college professor. Like, you were supposed to have read this before you got to class. But if you didn't, I would definitely go and read about the 6 steps. Because for anyone who is creating anything, from comics to a movie to a book to a fucking pamphlet to get more people to visit, like, the Chicago Museum of Art. Like, whatever you're doing, if it has any artistic merit to it at all, you have to examine these 6 steps and get there.
Why are you doing it?
Yeah, why...
What form are you doing it in?
Yeah. Yeah, I guess we should go through them real quick. Idea, purpose. First, the impulses, the idea, the emotions, the philosophies, the purpose, the work's content. So, some people think that's the only step. That is number 1 on the 6-step process. Number 2 is form. The form it will take. Will it be a book, a chalk drawing, a chair, a song, a sculpture, a pot holder, a comic book?
Gonna do some embroidery.
Hey. Fucking art.
Oh yeah, 100%.
Counts.
Not complaining. As someone who's trying embroidery.
You're gonna reenact that scene from Ghost, but with a praying mantis? James A. Caster. Watch his specials on Netflix. Third, idiom. The school of art, the vocabulary of styles or gestures or subject matter, the genre that the work belongs to. Maybe it's a genre of its own, which I like. He lets you get out of the box if you need to.
Whatever you need to make.
Yeah. 4 is structure, putting it all together, what to include, what to leave out, how to arrange, how to compose the work. 5 is craft, constructing the works, applying skills, practical knowledge, inventing problem solving, getting the job done. And 6 is the surface. Production values, finishing the aspects most apparent on first superficial exposure to the work, which I assume involves giving your elevator pitch if you are in fact trying to sell it to somebody. But yeah, all the surface stuff, which is the first thing people notice and the last thing you're supposed to work on, which I thought was an interesting way to view that.
It is.
Yeah. Then we're getting to chapter 8, which I really like because it's a word about color. And man, this slapped the crap out of me because this thing's been black and white up to this point.
Yep.
And then all of a sudden he throws color in here and slaps the shit out of me. And I think that's just another way to express how strong color was.
Yeah. Because, like I said earlier, the panels where we're just showing emotion.
Yeah.
I didn't get a lot of those.
Needed some color.
I need color for that.
Yeah. So on page 188, the last 2 panels. Many see the superhero as a form of modern mythology. If so, this aspect of color may play a part. Symbols are the stuff of which gods are made. Another property of flat color is their tendency to emphasize the shape of objects, both animate and inanimate. So, he has a picture with someone thinking about Batman and Hulk, and it's just the color patterns that make those characters. And again, something I had never thought of, but once I did, I was like, oh, that's why. Like, that's why these comic book characters have these bright, flashy colors. Because at the time, that's what you could get to show up on these cheap paper that people were printing comics on. Like, the reason so many villains have these contrasting colors, like both the Riddler and Joker are bright purple and green, like, because these contrasts will show up. Batman is like blue and then yellow separating gray. Hulk is green and red, or green and purple again when he wore his purple pants in the 80s, like, and before. And I thought that was, again, something that I should have known and didn't.
Color creates a lot of mood, and like he talks about tone and like how the colors evolved in print. Mm-hmm. It's just really neat.
Yeah, and he does go back to what you were talking about earlier. Talk about how different colors express can-do moods.
Like, my favorite thing, so, like, rewatching, and this is not exactly about comics, but rewatching, like, the Sailor Moon anime from the 90s.
Yeah.
The pastel colors and the way the backgrounds are always, like, so bright adds to the way it feels when you watch it.
Yeah. Absolutely. I think you can see it in cartoon animation in a way that I think only comics also match, where the color usage and they just pull so much out of you as an audience.
Yes, like, 100%.
The top page 192, very interestingly, he talks about the difference between black and white versus color. And this, by the way, is the shortest chapter. Yep. He talks about how it's expensive to do color. I don't know if that's why this is the shortest chapter, but it is something he mentions. He says, the difference between black and white and color comics are vast and profound, affecting every level of the reading experience. In black and white, the ideas behind the art are communicated more directly, meaning they transcend form. Art approaches language. In flat colors, forms themselves take on a more significance. The words become a playground of shapes and space. And through more expressive colors, comics can become an intoxicating environment of sensation that only color can give. And yeah, once again, I got nothing else to say, but fuck yeah.
He is right.
Yeah. And this takes us to our, sadly, last chapter, chapter 9, putting it all together. He talks about the ideas that basically he has expressed through this entire book and smushes them all together to talk about how to make a comic from start to finish. I like how he talks about the struggle of the artist to take something out of their mind and to put it on paper. He says, the comic I see in my mind will never be seen in their entirety by anyone else, no matter how hard I try. It's kind of like finding out that life is meaningless. Because it is both very sad, but also very freeing.
Yeah.
It's like, if I know from the beginning I'm going to fail to get my ideas in a way that anyone else can see them exactly as I do, then I'm kind of freed up to do the best I can without worry of failure, because failure's assured at the beginning. And he's like, it's never going to be what I want you to see exactly.
Yeah, if life has no meaning, then the meaning I give it is good enough.
It's important. Yeah, that has value. Yep. And I'm not being pressured by the invisible ghost man on the cloud to do it in a certain way. Like that is, that's exhaustingly freeing. I also like on, again, he talks about the form and the content and how they're separated and how you need to be able to see them as two separate entities. The form that a comic takes versus what's actually in the content. And he once again talks about how people who don't take comics seriously can't see the content for the form.
Yeah.
And how we are much better and more enlightened than those people, and that makes us great and makes them suck. He doesn't say that in as many words, but I can read between the lines. I can read between the gutters.
There you go.
I know what he's saying. I also love this. On top of page 201, Rudolf Toffer, he has 2 quotes by him. And the first one is, the picture story, which critics disregard and scholars scarcely notice, has had great influence at all times, perhaps even more than written literature. And the next panel, in addition, the picture story appeals mainly to children in the lower classes. I'm like, way to put yourself in a very clear box for us, Toffer, so we know who you are and where you're coming from. Through the words and writings of these neglected masters, we see the first glimpses of comics' limitless potential as an art form and the attitudes that were to obscure that potential for many years to come. So that's really the closest he gets to talking about the white-centric view of the viewpoint of these people, is picking a white guy that didn't like comics and saying, hey, this fucking guy, am I right? But he talks about comic artists who didn't really get their due all through history.
Yeah.
That now people are kind of going back to them and looking again. And then these next pages are just beautiful. Yes. Because there's only a few panels per page. Like we're reaching the punching points of the book, the most important parts of the book. And the way he chooses to visualize each page is wonderful. Like, I cannot support enough everything that he said up to this point. He really sums up in these last 11 pages wonderfully with like beautiful art,
showing the difference between the icons and the words and the time, the shape, and how time is.
Yeah, the difference in what's happening in the gutters, the different senses that get touched, the seeds of expressionism and synthesetics, like every weird crazy things he talks about. But evolutionary is a tricky thing. Species evolve differently in different climates. So it was in Japan where comics developed relatively isolation, spawning a host of unique approaches to making comics. Which, again, he touches on quite a bit, but he could have touched on it more, since pretty much...
I wish that he had.
Pretty much American comics and Japanese comics are the 2 biggest markets of comics in this world as they stand together.
As comics grow into the next century, creators will aspire to many higher goals than appealing to the lowest common denominator. Ignorance and short-sighted business practices will no doubt obscure the possibilities of comics from time to time, as they always have, but the truth about comics can't stay hidden from view forever, and sooner or later the truth will shine through.
Fucking beautiful.
Today, the possibility for comics are, as they always have been, endless. So, just a side note here, I really do think he'd like how... So, he's talking about, like, the possibility of comics. I think that modern technology has really helped expand the amount of people who can create and the amount of people who can be exposed to comics.
Yes.
Like, all of the apps on my phone, all of the different ways that, like, particular individual people can write something and get it out to people, the way people can make stories that other people actually get to see.
Yeah.
I think is really fascinating.
He has actually written 2 other books, and one of them is very much about the future of comics, and I was hoping they had a bibliography, or not bibliography, but other books by in here somewhere, but they do not. But he's actually written 2 more books on comics, and these actually got bigger than Zog, and actually got bigger than the comics he made for quote-unquote entertainment value. So he's... As a comic scholar, he actually got bigger than he did as a comic artist. Yeah.
So I want to read this last page.
Please do.
And This
is how we end Understanding Comics.
So I've learned a lot about comics since the beginning of the project, and I know I have a lot left to learn. I hope you all consider exploring or continuing to explore comics on your own. However, you experience comics as reader, creator, or businessman, there are 1,000,001 ways you can help comics grow into the next century. Think about it, and thanks for listening. Oh wow, did I take that long? I'm sorry, I better let you go. Back to the old drawing board. And then his wife's in the background saying, at least you're not married to him. I get this all the time. As someone who hyper-focuses and forces everyone around me to also listen to the thing that I am currently hyper-focusing on, I am Scott in this instance.
Yeah.
And I apologize.
So relatable. Well, I mean, we wouldn't have a podcast if you didn't, so thank you. We actually appreciate it here at Comic Dissection. But that is Understanding Comics, The Invisible Art. If you did not read it for this, I strongly suggest you read it. If you have any love for comics at all,
yes.
It will give you an entire new viewpoint on comics and a great new respect for them. And I'm sure since 1993, other books have been written about comics.
He says in the back, on the very last page, on like the little notes, like he hopes people continue to have these conversations.
Yes.
Like he wants you to...
I've had my say, now it's your turn.
Yeah.
And he has a list of a selected bibliography and copyright information. He's got a lot of information there for you to go and find.
Yes.
Like if there was a panel from a comic that blew your mind, you can pick up that comic. If you want to learn more about where he got some of his ideas from, he's got bibliography. This is, even though it's a comic book, and this is what he's been saying the whole time, you need to treat it like a historical reference guide, because that is very much what it is.
Yeah.
In addition to his opinions, there's a lot of cold, hard facts in here that really help the vision be understood clearly. But please pick up Understanding Comics. If you listen to this podcast for 16 years, and the only thing you take away from it is getting Understanding Comics and reading it to get a better love for the genre that brought us all here today, then fucking do that, please.
Yeah.
Yeah, please do. And also, I would suggest a Google search of, hey, I liked Understanding Comics. What else out there is there to help me understand comics better? And I bet you, since 1993, at least one book has been written.
One hopes.
Yes,
right.
I would like to know, like, the places that weren't really touched on in Understanding Comics because they didn't have a strong comic presence in 1992, but probably would today. Yeah. I bet there's a lot of stuff out of Africa, out of South America, out of Australia that like didn't exist in 1992, or at least weren't well known enough that Scott McCloud mentions them.
Yeah.
And they are going to also be totally different from the Asian influence and the European American influence.
I was going to say, he focuses very much so on like the Western perspective.
Right.
I'm sure that there are books just about Japanese comics.
Absolutely.
Like 100%. Yeah.
I mean, if nothing else, if you got a book, there's a million of them. I see them all the time about how to draw Japanese manga. How to draw anime characters. You would learn a lot about the Japanese art style just from those. But I would like to have one that is a historical reference book like this, written in comic book form, because that's fucking awesome. But that, fills in these gaps from because I have no idea what kind of art comes out, comic books come out of Africa. I have no idea what kind of comic books come out of South America. Again, I don't know what those crazy convicts in Australia are doing. Like, I have no idea. I would like to.
Completely understandable.
So that is the end of Understanding Comics. Next time, Moss Part 2. I do. I didn't want to leave Moss as the last thing we talked about because it's going to bum me out.
Okay.
So I wanted to mention that. Next time, Moss Part 2. But before we wrap up for today, I have the big question, and it's very relatively simple. Cecilia, what has made you, from Understanding Comics, if there was one thing you could take away that has made you look at comics differently from Understanding Comics, what would it be? For me, it was the Blood in the Gutter chapters and understanding what happens between the panels and how much of that I'm doing and how much of that is based on a very trusting relationship between the people creating the comic and the person reading the comic that I will get, because they're leaving me on between those two panels in the gutters, I'm left on my own and they trust me to get where they want me to go. And that's a strong relationship that I never thought of until I read Understanding Comics. Was there something in here that touched you that same way?
Honestly, I would say between looking at more ancient texts as things like comics, that one really hit me because I had never had that thought before.
Yeah, same.
And the noticing the shapes of the panels. Because after reading that, I was reading one of my manhwas, and I was scrolling through it, and there was a part where the comic had, like, the face was in the panels, but it was all surrounded by, like, jagged shapes.
Yeah.
And it's not something I would have noticed before reading that, because I just kind of roll with it most of the time.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I wonder how much of that is instinctual, and how much of it is copying other comics, and how much of it is someone read Understanding Comics. Like, I wonder, and each artist and writer is going to have different, their influence is going to come from different places, but yeah, I feel like I could make a much better comic than I could before I read this.
100%.
And can appreciate comics better than before I read this. So, I'm done gushing. Scott McCloud,
bring the tissues for next episode.
You're still alive. Come to the podcast.
He says that you can mention him in the back of that book. I think when we put this episode out, we should totally at him.
We're gonna add him and see if he's still around and if he's on social media. But I assume he is, because he wrote about making comics in the digital age. So obviously he's not one of those. What do you call the people that are scared of technology?
Technophobes.
Thank you. Well, yeah, but there's a weird word.
Is there a weird word for it?
A weirder than technophobe, which is kind of a weird word. Yeah.
I thought it was.
Yeah. Damn it. That's going to drive me crazy. But I'll look it up. You know what? I'm not going to expose you all to this. I'll look it up afterwards.
He does have a Twitter.
Oh, my God. Oh, man. When this episode comes out, I'm going to make friends with Scott McCloud.
I just had our Twitter follow him.
My heart's beating. Okay, I'm calm. Oh, my God. I'm going to meet Scott McCloud. We're going to be best friends.
Hey,
okay.
You got to have one.
Gotta have a best friend?
Yep.
No, we were best friends. Okay. I'm going to go cry it out. In 2 weeks' time,
you'll be crying with us.
Moss Part 2. Yeah, prepare to cry with us. Until then, so long, friends.
Bye-bye.